I'm Emily. I'm 30 years old, and last week I walked into my own birthday party at the Obsidian Hall in Chicago only to discover it was actually my trial. 75 relatives were there, but not a single one was smiling. My father, Joseph, handed me a cold folder containing DNA results and said, "You're not ours. Pay us back $1 million for every cent we wasted on you, then get out." My mother, Stephanie, snatched my car keys right out of my hand before I could even react. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community. I didn't cry. I didn't scream or beg or ask them how they could be so cruel. Instead, I felt a strange, icy clarity settle over me. It wasn't a breakdown, it was an audit. I stood in the middle of that silent, judging crowd and realized that for 30 years, I had been the silent investor in a business that was going bankrupt. Joseph and Stephanie weren't my parents. They were CEOs of a failing enterprise who had just decided to terminate my contract. Fine. If the relationship was strictly financial, let's look at the balance sheet. I slowly reached into my clutch and pulled out my phone. Joseph watched me, his chin tilted up, probably expecting me to call a lawyer or a friend to sob. He was wrong. I didn't look at the 75 relatives watching me. I didn't look at Stephanie, who was triumphantly jingling my car keys. I opened my banking app. For the last 7 years, I had been sending Joseph $1,000 every single month to cover his so-called business losses. That was $84,000 of pure, unrecorded charity. I navigated to the recurring payments section. My thumb didn't even tremble as I hit the button labeled "Cancel all future transfers." Done. The first leak in their bucket was plugged. Then, I turned my attention to Madison. My younger sister was standing near the bar, her phone already out, likely checking her follower count. She was carrying a luxury handbag that cost more than my first 2 months of rent, a bag I had paid for on my secondary credit card. I opened my card management settings. Madison's name was right there, listed as an authorized user. I had given her that card because Joseph said she needed a safety net while she built her influencer brand. I hit disable card and watched her. It only took 30 seconds. A server approached her with a bottle of champagne she had likely ordered to celebrate her sister's downfall. Madison handed him the card with a smug grin. A moment later, the server shook his head and handed it back. The sound that came out of her mouth was a high-pitched shriek that pierced through the sophisticated atmosphere of the Obsidian Hall. "My card! Emily, what is wrong with this thing? It says it's declined!" She turned toward me, her face twisting in a mix of confusion and mounting rage. "Fix it! I have a live stream in 10 minutes." I didn't answer her. I didn't even look at her. I simply tucked my phone back into my clutch. Anger wasn't loud this time. It was clinical. I looked at Joseph and Stephanie. They weren't shocked by what they'd done to me. They were shocked that I had stopped playing along. "The car's in my name." "Stephanie," I said, my voice cutting through the whispers of the relatives. "Keep the keys. I'll report it stolen the moment I walk out those doors. As for the $1 million you think I owe you, consider my monthly payments for the last 7 years, the interest on the debt I never signed for." I picked up my bag and began to walk toward the exit. The click of my heels on the marble floor was the only sound in the room. I felt lighter than I had in years. This wasn't revenge. It was accounting. And I was just getting started on the ledger. The city lights of Chicago blurred as I walked toward the curb, feeling the sharp wind off the lake bite through my navy dress. I didn't care about the steel and leather. Stephanie was clutching back in that hall like a trophy. I cared about the 3,650 nights I had spent working until dawn while they slept soundly on the mattresses I paid for. I walked past the towering glass structures that defined this city. People saw art, but I saw calculations. I saw the literal blood and sweat required to keep something from falling apart. That had been my role for 30 years, the structural support for a family that was rotten at the core. While Madison was busy curating her perfect life for 50,000 followers, I was at my desk in the architecture firm, my eyes bloodshot, drafting blueprints for clients who didn't even know my name. I remember one winter when the heat in my studio apartment went out. I didn't ask Joseph for help. I couldn't. I was too busy sending him $1,000 that month because his latest consulting venture had cratered. I wore 2 coats and worked by the light of a single desk lamp, telling myself it was fine. I was the capable one. For a long time, I carried a set of invisible chains. People looking from the outside probably thought I was weak. They saw a successful architect letting her parents bleed her dry and wondered why I didn't just walk away. But they didn't understand the psychology of a survivor. I was living in a prison without bars. Every dollar I sent home, every insult I swallowed, was a payment I was making to buy a seat at their table. I wasn't being exploited, I was negotiating for love. Or so I thought. My compassion had been a luxury they'd overdrafted for years. I had been the silent investor in their version of family, footing the bill for a subscription that never actually gave me access to the content. I looked at a crumpled blueprint in my bag, a design for a luxury estate I'd secretly hoped we would all share one day. I smoothed it out with a hand that no longer shook, then watched the wind catch it and carry it toward the dark Chicago River. I realized then that my capability was their weapon. They didn't ignore me because I was strong. They ignored me because I was useful. My worth wasn't something they celebrated, it was something they harvested. I thought about the $84,000 in direct transfers and the countless other loans that added up to over $100,000 in 7 years. The ledger was finally clear. The debt wasn't mine, it was theirs. And for the first time in 30 years, I wasn't interested in a repayment plan. I was interested in a total liquidation. I turned my back on the Obsidian Hall and finally started designing a life that didn't have room for them in the floor plan. The morning after the party didn't bring the silence of a finished battle, it brought the roar of a full-scale digital siege. I woke up to my phone vibrating against the nightstand, a relentless hum of notifications that felt like a swarm of insects. It wasn't the sound of regret or apologies from Joseph and Stephanie. It was the sound of a coordinated execution. Joseph hadn't waited for the sun to come up before he started digging. By 8 in the morning, I had received an email from the Architectural Board of Illinois. Joseph had leveraged his old connections as a former board member to file a formal complaint against my professional standing. He was alleging unethical financial conduct and moral instability, claiming I had embezzled funds from my own family. He wasn't just trying to take my car or my savings anymore, he was moving to revoke my license. He was trying to dismantle the very foundation of the career I had built with my own sweat. He wanted to make sure I couldn't just walk away and thrive. He wanted me back on my knees, begging for a way to survive. Then there was Madison. My sister hadn't let the night at the Obsidian Hall end. She had spent the last 8 hours editing her live stream, turning my humiliation into a 3-part viral series. She sat in our parents' kitchen, her mascara artfully smeared to look like she had been crying for hours. She told 50,000 people that I was a predatory gold digger who had discovered I was adopted and immediately tried to drain our parents' retirement accounts. The comments were a bloodbath. Complete strangers were calling my office, leaving 1-star reviews, and demanding I be fired. As I watched Madison's face on my screen, I finally recognized the mechanism behind her behavior. This was the trap of normalized cruelty. In Joseph and Stephanie's world, relationships were never about love. They were about the extraction of value. They had spent 30 years training me to believe that my only worth came from my utility. I was the reliable, income-generating asset, the one who kept the lights on and the debts paid while they focused on their flashy investment, Madison. Joseph and Stephanie didn't hate me because I wasn't their biological daughter. They hated me because an asset had suddenly developed a will of its own. To them, my decision to stop the transfers wasn't a boundary, it was a breach of contract. When a piece of machinery stops working, you don't apologize to it, you scrap it for parts. They were trying to strip me of my reputation, my license, and my dignity because they viewed those things as their property, not mine. I looked at the $1 million demand still sitting in my inbox. It was no longer a request for reimbursement. It was a ransom note for my future. They wanted me erased. They wanted the world to believe I was a fraud so they could maintain the illusion that they were the victims. I sat in my quiet apartment, the Chicago wind rattling my windows, and felt the last bit of familial warmth vanish. They thought they were liquidating a liability. They thought they were clearing the books of an unwanted daughter. But they had forgotten one thing about architects. We don't just look at what's standing on the surface. We look at the footings. We look at the hidden supports. And I knew where all their secrets were buried. I opened a new file on my computer and labeled it audit. If they wanted a war over the ledger, I was going to give them a total forensic reconstruction. I stopped fighting with feelings and started fighting with facts. If Joseph and Stephanie wanted to treat our relationship as a hostile takeover, I was going to bring in the heavy hitters to handle the litigation. I spent the next few days in a high-rise office downtown, sitting across from a forensic accountant and a family law attorney who specialized in high-stakes fraud. We weren't just looking at the $100,000 I'd sent home over the last 7 years. We were looking at the entire 30-year history of the Patterson family's acquisition of me. My lawyer, a sharp woman named Julia, didn't look at me with pity. She looked at me like a puzzle that needed solving. We started with the lost birth certificate. Within 48 hours, she had pulled the original records from the county. There had been no flood in 2005. What she found instead was a legal seal on a trust fund that was supposed to have been released to me on my 25th birthday. I watched Julia's face go cold as she flipped through the digital ledger. "Emily," she said, her voice dropping to a clinical whisper, "your biological mother, Catherine, didn't just leave you with a couple of construction workers. She left you a $2 million trust fund managed by Joseph as your legal guardian." I felt the air leave my lungs. $2 million. I had been eating ramen and working 80-hour weeks while $2 million of my own inheritance sat in a vault somewhere. But Julia wasn't done. She pulled up a series of withdrawal slips dated 10 years ago. Each one was signed with my name. "I didn't sign these," I said, my voice steady but sharp. "I was 20 years old. I didn't even know this money existed." "I know you didn't," Julia replied, sliding a side-by-side comparison across the desk. "The signatures are sophisticated, but the pressure points are wrong. These are forgeries, Emily. Joseph and Stephanie didn't just take you in. They embezzled $2 million from a child and then spent the next decade gaslighting you into thinking you owed them for the privilege." The ledger was no longer just unbalanced, it was a crime scene. They hadn't kept me around because they loved me, or even because I was a useful, capable daughter. They had kept me around to maintain the guardianship that gave them access to my mother's money. They had lied about my biological father being dead because if I had found him, their $2 million subscription would have been canceled instantly. I rubbed my eyes, trying to summon regret, but there was only clarity. This wasn't a family dispute, it was a racketeering case. They had leveraged my guilt to extract $100,000 of my salary while they lived off the $2 million they stole from my past. I looked at the debt Joseph claimed I owed him. $1 million. It was a projection of their own theft. They were terrified that once I turned 30 and gained full legal autonomy, I'd start asking the questions I was asking right now. The party at the Obsidian Hall wasn't a trial, it was a preemptive strike. They wanted to ruin my reputation and bury me in fake debt, so I'd be too broken to ever look into the books. "Calm, factual, and lethal," Julia said, closing the folder. "That's how we're going to handle this. We're not just stopping the payments. We're filing for a total asset recovery and criminal fraud charges." Inside, my laptop glowed with a different kind of sunrise, the kind made of facts, numbers, and quiet retribution. The Pattersons thought they were liquidating a liability. They had no idea I was about to call in the debt of a lifetime. The silence in the press room was a heavy, suffocating blanket. Joseph sat at the long mahogany table, his face a mask of practiced concern, while Stephanie sat beside him, dabbing at eyes that hadn't seen a real tear in 3 decades. They had called this meeting to set the record straight, inviting the very board members who held my professional future in their hands. They wanted to bury me under a mountain of fabricated debt and moral outrage before Julia's legal team could even file the first motion. "We only wanted to protect her," Joseph said into the microphone, his voice echoing with a hollow, fatherly resonance that used to make me feel small. "But Emily has chosen a path of greed over gratitude. She owes this family $1 million. And more than that, she owes this city an apology for her conduct." I stood at the back of the room, my arms crossed, watching the performance. I didn't feel the old familiar pang of rejection. I didn't feel the need to shout or defend my character. I just felt the weight of the evidence in my bag. I felt like a structural engineer watching a building with a cracked foundation finally begin to groan. That's when the heavy double doors at the rear of the hall swung open. A man stepped through the threshold. He didn't rush. He didn't shout. He walked with the effortless, quiet authority of someone who owned the air he breathed. He wore a charcoal suit that cost more than Joseph's entire consulting firm, and his eyes that matched mine, with terrifying precision, were fixed solely on the man at the podium. Joseph's voice died in his throat. The microphone emitted a sharp, high-pitched feedback whine as his hand began to shake. Stephanie stood up so quickly her chair screeched against the floor. "You," she whispered, the word barely a breath of terror. "You were supposed to be dead. I was only dead in the narratives you sold for profit," the man said. His voice was deep, calm, and absolutely lethal. "My name is Benjamin, and I am here to close the accounts on 30 years of theft." He walked to the front of the room, ignoring the gasps from the 75 guests and the flashes from the cameras. He placed a thick, leather-bound ledger on the table, directly in front of Joseph. "You demanded $1 million from Emily for the cost of raising her?" Benjamin asked, his tone clinical. "Interesting. Because, according to my wire transfer records, I've been paying for her subscription to this family since 1998. You leveraged the non-contact agreement I signed 30 years ago to keep me in the dark, funneling my payments through a trust manager you had in your pocket. For 3 decades, you sent me falsified progress reports and doctored photos, convincing me that Emily was thriving but wanted nothing to do with the father who abandoned her. $3,000 every single month for 28 years, totaling $1,008,000. I paid for the education she never received. I paid for the medical care you made her work 3 jobs to cover. I paid for a life of safety that you turned into a decade of psychological warfare." Joseph fell to his knees, his joints hitting the carpet with a dull thud. He looked at the papers, the bank statements, the transaction IDs, and the signatures Stephanie had used to confirm receipt of the blood money for nearly 3 decades. The relatives who had been nodding in Joseph's favor moments ago now recoiled, their faces shifting from judgment to pure, unadulterated disgust. Stephanie tried to reach for my hand, her face contorting into a mask of desperate affection. "Emily, sweetheart, we did it for you. We were keeping that money safe. We're a family." I stepped back, my expression as cold and immutable as the Chicago skyline. I looked at the 2 people who had spent my entire life treating me like a liability to be managed and realized I didn't see parents anymore. I saw 2 defaulting creditors who had finally reached the end of their credit limit. "Family isn't a contract you can forge, Stephanie," I said, my voice cutting through her frantic sobs. "And love isn't a resource you can embezzle. You didn't raise a daughter. You managed an asset. But today, the asset is liquidating the company." I looked at Joseph, who was staring at the floor, his carefully curated world turning to ash around him. "The debt hasn't just been paid," I told him. "It's been overdrawn. I'm not filing for a settlement. I'm filing for a total forensic reckoning. I don't have parents. I only have creditors who have finally been paid in full by their own greed." I turned and walked out of the hall with Benjamin beside me. Behind us, the room erupted into a different kind of noise, not the silence of a trial, but the roar of a scandal that would ensure the Pattersons never held a seat at any Chicago table again. The legal reckoning didn't drag on like a messy family drama. It proceeded with the surgical precision of a structural audit. In the face of the forged signatures and the 28 years of wire transfer records Benjamin provided, Joseph and Stephanie had no defense left to offer. The court didn't see a misunderstanding between parents and a daughter. The judge saw $2 million in embezzled trust funds and $1,008,000 in hidden support payments. Joseph and Stephanie were eventually sentenced to 5 years for grand larceny and systemic fraud. The Chicago social circles they had spent decades trying to impress didn't offer them a single word of sympathy. The country clubs and the boardrooms they once treated as their own kingdom were closed to them forever. Their positions were only a facade built on someone else's foundation. And when the truth came out, that foundation crumbled instantly. Madison's fate was perhaps the most clinical. Her 50,000 followers vanished within 48 hours after the live stream of our confrontation went viral for all the wrong reasons. Brands pulled their sponsorships, citing her lack of integrity. The last I heard, she was working as a junior clerk, struggling to make payments on a life she can no longer afford. As for me, I didn't spend a single cent of the recovered trust fund on luxury or excess. I took that $2 million and the $100,000 in salary I had reclaimed and founded the Genesis Architectural Academy. It is a place designed specifically for orphans and children in the foster system who have the talent to build, but no one to give them the initial blueprint. I realized that the best revenge isn't the destruction of your enemies, it is the construction of a legacy they could never imagine. I don't look back at the Obsidian Hall with anger anymore. I look at it as the moment I finally stopped being a silent investor in a lie. My relationship with Benjamin is growing slowly, built on the steady, honest bricks of shared time and shared truth. We meet every Sunday in a small cafe, discussing blueprints and life over coffee that tastes like freedom. I learned that your worth isn't a number on a debt sheet written by people who only want to use you. If someone consistently makes you feel like you are a burden or an afterthought, that is simply information. Listen to it and walk away. Setting boundaries isn't a betrayal, it is an act of structural integrity. For 30 years, they tried to make me invisible, but now I'm finally standing in the light of a life I designed myself. If the story of the Blood Ledger taught you that it's never too late to reclaim your worth, please share this video with one person who feels like they don't belong. Don't forget to subscribe to follow more journeys of justice and self-respect. Take care of yourselves, and remember, you are the architect of your own future.